Hello, and welcome to the VBAC Facts podcast. I'm Jen Camel, VBAC Facts founder. Today we have a guest who will be talking with us about the concept of medical mistrust. But before we get into that interview, I want to share with you another hospital vaginal birth after 2 cesarean story from a reader. Here is Emilie's vaginal birth after 2 cesarean story from Alberta, Canada. My first birth story started with me being 2 weeks late, which led to me being induced and cascaded into a series of interventions that I didn't want and did not plan for. I finally got to 10 centimeters and pushed for 1 hour, but the doctor came in and announced failure to progress. Things ended in a very traumatic cesarean that caused a severe laceration to my cervix and uterus. I was also told by this doctor that I had CPD. Now, CPD is when they say that the baby's head, it cannot fit through the pelvis, and that I should probably not attempt a vaginal delivery for subsequent pregnancies. We had a healthy baby and healthy mom, so I should have been happy. That's what I was told. Instead, I was left feeling like my body was broken and like the medical system had failed me. When I got pregnant with our son, I knew I wanted to try a VBAC, but I was incredibly scared. I had PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, from my first birth, but didn't know how to get help. I wanted to trust my body, but I didn't know if I could because of the physical and mental traumas I had endured. I was prepared as best as I could, but I remember avoiding thoughts of a repeat cesarean in the fear that thinking of it would make it a reality. When my son was ready to be born, my water broke spontaneously. We went to the hospital and then labor stopped. I was then started on Pitocin. Eventually, baby and I were showing signs of infection. We were faced with making a decision between a repeat, more civilized C-section or continuing to labor and potentially needing a crash C-section if things continued to go south. We opted for the C-section. My birth team was supportive and enabled a gentle cesarean experience. Immediately after birth, our son required a NICU admission, and I ended up with a post-operative infection a few days later. Although it was not what I had hoped for, and may sound like it was traumatic, I did not feel traumatized from this birth. I had a doula and birth team that made me feel like I had a say and was supported in the decisions I made. When I got pregnant with our last baby, I continued to have a grave desire to birth vaginally. I knew deep down that I did not have CPD and that I could trust my body to birth a baby naturally. I did an enormous amount of preparation physically, mentally, and spiritually. I got on with a very supportive group of midwives and OBs and hired Megan, my doula. All 3 were crucial in helping me achieve my goal. I had many obstacles to overcome, but having their support and a solid plan in place made all the difference. This time, I was prepared for a successful vaginal birth after 2 cesareans, but also for a beautiful, healing repeat cesarean. Either way, I just wanted to be supported and empowered by my birth experience. My labor started slowly the day and evening of March 22nd. I went to bed early that night, and around 4 or 5 in the morning, things started to pick up, but I was managing well on my own. By the time the 2 older kids got up, I told my husband to call the doula and to get the kids off to the babysitter. Shortly before Megan arrived, things were starting to get intense, and I remember thinking we should get to the hospital. But as soon as Megan walked into our home, her calming presence and gentle demeanor helped me to settle down and continue to labor at home. Within an hour of her being there, my water broke and things got even more intense quite quickly. We decided it was time to go to the hospital. I was immediately admitted and was assessed and was told I was 9.5 centimeters dilated. I was left to labor how I felt comfortable with the assistance of Megan, my midwife, and her student, and my husband. I was also being monitored by an angel of a nurse who respected my plan and what I was trying to achieve. I advocated for myself a few times during my birth, something I was not able to do in my first birth. My birth team was so proud of me for speaking up and doing what felt best for me instead of obeying hospital policies to appease the staff. Baby Marie arrived March 23rd at 13:13. She was born vaginally 1 week before her due date, weighing 6 pounds, 3 ounces. After all of that preparation and planning, I got my successful vaginal birth after 2 cesareans. All I wanted was a fair chance to let my body do what it was designed to do. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, but I feel truly empowered by my final birth story. I am open to you reading my story, but I am too shy to be interviewed for a podcast. Thank you for all the work you do. And thank you, Emilie, for sharing your birth story with us. It's through your words and your experience and sharing that with my audience that enables people to see what is possible. And I think particularly for vaginal birth after 2 cesareans, it's incredibly powerful to show that not only does it happen in a hospital, but it can happen with supportive OBs, midwives, and nurses. And it dovetails quite perfectly with today's guest, Amber Vayo, a maternal health and politics researcher who centers birth stories. Her use of qualitative and ethnographic studies brings real-world data into health policy discussions. She is the creator and host of the podcast Birthzillas and author of the forthcoming book, Birthzillas, Mad Wives, and the Politics of Childbirth. Welcome, Amber. I'm so excited for you to join us.
Sure. Happy to be here.
So I'd love to hear a little bit about your background and how you became interested in the politics of childbirth.
So my background is in political science. I started as a constitutional law person, and then my midwife said to me, see if there's anything you can do about the laws that relate to childbirth. And every time I brought it up, people were like, oh, why do you want to study that? You study the Constitution. And it was very clear to me that on the ground, birth was seen as less important than anything else. And to me, I was like, well, it's how we all get here. So maybe we should bring that back. And when I suggested the term, the politics of childbirth, I was shot down repeatedly by everyone in my committee and everyone in my school that said that wasn't a thing. But I did just recently have an article that is soon to be published in the International Encyclopedia of Gender and Politics titled The Politics of Childbirth.
Nice.
The best revenge is publishing.
Yeah. And what do you think is behind this complete disinterest? This idea that like constitutional law is very elevated, but the politics of childbirth is not worth our time.
Well, I think it's about who matters, right? We're so used to not just the unpaid labor of women, but seeing mothers as people who not only are required to sacrifice, but should not even complain about it. And most of us do that. But the fact that when there's a problem, we're expected to do it is, to me, really weird. And so it was this idea that every other group gets to complain if there's a problem, but not moms. No matter who you are, you're not supposed to complain. You're not supposed to ask for more. And to me, that is a deeply political power issue.
So why do you think we should talk about birth stories?
I think that there are so many different ways to understand childbirth. You have these big quantity data sets that we absolutely need to say when is a law or a policy working, when is an intervention working or not working. But you lose the forest for the trees, or in this case, the trees for the forest, when you don't hear from people, because every birth is different, but there are connections, there are similarities. And at some point, those similarities become patterns that we should also study. And so your hospital, Massachusetts is listed, it's where I live, the best state to give birth. I talked to 120 people, and you would not expect that, right? If you'd heard the stories I heard. So the question is, who gets to decide what this best means? And if this is the best, what is it like elsewhere? And so it's really powerful for people.
I wonder, how was Massachusetts being the best state? What were the factors that went into determining this is the best state?
So part of it was, obviously who's got more insurance. Massachusetts has the most insured with health insurance population. They counted things like, spontaneous vaginal birth rather than inductions. They counted different maternal mortality issues. But it was never a question of, did you talk to people? Did you ask who's the most satisfied? They did not. They did not ask that.
That is so fascinating that was not a question they considered. And so is that one of those moments where you were like, I really need to counter the data with the faces of the people experiencing the data?
It's not even necessarily to counter it. It's to supplement it and say, like, good, great, we're the best. But if we're the best and all of these people are unhappy, we either need to change what we think of as best or be really worried about everybody else who's not the best, right? That there's a problem here with what we're seeing. And again, it is that policy by necessity has to look at big numbers. It has to look at groups. It has to look at statistics. But you miss out on opportunities to really build trust, to build health, to build long-term care in health policy if you're not also taking into consideration the people in the system.
So what were the most surprising things that you uncovered during your research?
Wild to me is how big a deal trust is. Like, it, but I was so surprised. I would talk to people and they told me a story that was like a horrifying. And then they were like, but it was fine. And they trusted their doctor. They trusted their nurse. And a story that should have had a really scary, horrible ending, they felt better about because they trusted that everybody in the room helped them. Conversely, I heard stories from people that had pretty normal, standard experiences who felt really traumatized and really horrible because they had no idea why anything that happened to them did. It was something as an outsider, you're like, oh, it makes sense that all of these things would happen. But because they didn't have that information, they were constantly questioning and constantly feeling mistrustful. And so the trust and the ability of just baseline soft skills to increase trust, and the role that can play in shaping trauma or not trauma was kind of fascinating to me. It was not at all where I was going with the research, but, it's where I ended up.
I have a couple questions there. First, where did you think you were going and where did it take you? And then also, I'd love to hear more about the soft skills. And I'm sharing both because I fear that I'll forget one if I don't lay them both out on the table right now.
What I wanted to do was ask, do people think of rights in childbirth at all? And I was expecting to hear no, and that's basically what I heard. But they did think of it in terms of things like autonomy, like consent. My research came really similar to the Me Too movement time. Okay. And I think a lot of public conversations about consent were happening. You do my research 2 years earlier or 2 years later, it's a different ballgame. There was definitely a bubble. But there were still, even within that bubble, people who were like, when I said, what are your rights? I'd ask them at the end so that they weren't thinking, I wanted to know, what do they think about naturally? And then I'd ask at the end and they were like, well, you have a right, I think, to ask for food. You have a right, I think, to do this. And they had no idea, most of them, of what their rights were. And so that was, what I was expecting. But the turn it took was the trust and the communication, which of course leads to the soft skills. And the soft skills are just meeting people as people, meeting people as like, yes, this is a patient. Yes, you probably have a bunch of other ones. But this is somebody who doesn't have your experience as a doctor. As a nurse, they haven't seen 100 of these. They've seen 1 or 2. And whatever they're going through right now, you need to meet them there and talk them through it. And that has a massive impact on people's experiences and on how they feel about their experiences.
And then the soft skills.
That's really the soft skill, like that general communication, that ability to navigate conflict, the ability to navigate bias, and in particular, the ability to understand that not everybody who comes in mistrustful is crazy. For people who have experienced mistrust and have had bad experiences with the medical industry, with childbirth before, with doctors before, with whomever before, it is normal for them to be mistrustful. Don't take that as an offense. Take that as this person has had an experience, and if I meet them there, I help. And I think that's a soft skill that even throughout all of the anti-bias training, I don't really see present. As saying, acknowledge that it's okay if they question your expertise. Acknowledge that it's okay if they are worried about you. Build the trust. Don't just demand it.
Were there any other takeaways that you saw that you were like, this is something that clinicians and birth professionals can do to generate more trust?
Part of it was the talking, talking about interventions. And to that, there needs to be part on the patient as well. Know what you need to have answered. What do you
Mm.
like? Ideal case to not ideal case. What do you need answered to feel safe, and try to be able to ask that. But also, medical professionals need to be willing to answer it in a non-judgmental manner and not
Mm.
take it as a personal affront of I'm questioning your expertise. See it as
Yeah.
a what is happening to my body and my baby. Right.
Yeah.
That's the question. And I think reframing the way we view those questions is essential. The other big thing I saw, and I should have anticipated it because I'd felt it too, but I just didn't think about it. Everybody wants more birth centers. Whether I
Mm.
talked to people who did home birth or hospital birth, everybody wanted more birth center options. They wanted the technology that would be there, but in an area where there was more of that midwife model, one-on-one model of care, where technology was secondary. But even the people who had home birth, for them, it had been the choice of hospital or home. They also wanted that middle ground option. And so that was a
Mm.
really interesting policy element to it.
Yeah. So when you talk about birth centers, I'm wondering, are people talking about access, or maybe they're not thinking about the difference between the access to a freestanding birth center or a birth center that is within a hospital?
For most of them, they did not make any kind of differentiation. Any difference, either of those differences would have been acceptable. For the people who had done home birth, they wanted the freestanding birth center. So I think it was close to 11 or 12% of my sample actually had done home birth. So it
Oh,
was very much
interesting.
overrepresented, but
Yeah.
many of them had wanted some form of birth center, freestanding particularly. But a lot of the people who had been in hospitals or been in hospital affiliated birth centers, there were 3 or 4 of those I talked to, were all very much like, we wanted more birth centers. We wanted this to be its own specific area. We wanted the midwives in here with us, and that. So not a huge difference unless there's a difference. And I don't think a lot of people know there's a difference.
Yeah. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to ask the question, because when I think of a freestanding birth center, I think of a midwife who is practicing autonomously, as opposed to a birth center within a hospital where they are more subject to hospital policies that may or may not be aligned with the evidence. And maybe, and often are, quite paternalistic in terms of having midwives report to an OB rather than work in collaboration, a completely different dynamic.
So even the people that I talked to who had gone to birth centers that were affiliated with hospitals, the midwives were actually in charge of their whole care and only called the OBGYN in if there was an issue.
Okay.
And so I think, state by state, the rules on birth centers are so different that it's
Yeah.
really hard to tell. And I think from what I gathered, and I don't want to speak for other people, but from what I gathered is that they wanted something between the midwife only birth center and the hospital
Mhm.
birth center that you're talking about, in that sense of like, there would be, an on-call OBGYN, or there would be access to, medicated pain relief, but that
Mm.
ultimately the midwives would be in charge. There
Yeah.
really seemed to be like that best of both worlds.
Is there anything else you want to add in terms of how we can do better in terms of mitigating medical mistrust as well as managing it on the back end when people are engaging with healthcare? How clinicians can mitigate that mistrust that people are bringing with them into this situation?
One thing I see over and over is people wanted a way to complain and be taken seriously. I talked to
Mm.
a physician. She gave birth at the hospital she worked at. It was her 4th child. She'd done this before, and she self-described her experience as obstetric violence. She
Wow.
complained to the hospital. She complained to the state board of health, and from both of them was told, no, it's just standard practice. And this is an insider in the industry in that hospital. But again, 4 childbirths, right? She'd done it all. And so, when you have somebody like that who should have been able to complain, and the research on institutional betrayal, one of the things it shows us is when people feel as though they've been betrayed by an institution, often like, whether it's child abuse, whether it's police abuse, whether it's military sexual abuse, colleges ignoring sexual trauma, any of these institutions that are supposed to protect you, one of the ways people can feel better is by an open, honest grievance process. that is taken seriously, right? And not just everything pushed under the rug. And so the other example is a young woman I had spoken to who during COVID, she was really not sure what had happened to her in the hospital. And her baby was born with a disability. And the doctors and the nurses agreed that that was potentially the hospital's fault. And what they did was not go through lawyers. They went through offering her services, offering her help, offering her physical therapy, offering her child physical therapy. And when she had her next baby, she chose to have it at that hospital again, even though she had a choice, because the grievance process had helped her be like, somebody made a mistake. Most people understand that there are going to be mistakes made. We don't want to be the one you make it on. But when we are, at least give us that process that says you will learn from this, that you care enough about what happened to me, that you have a process where I can get, some kind of help. And a lot of hospitals don't have that. If you look through even complaints on people's medical licensure, some states don't even look at a complaint on your license before they allow you to practice in their state. Texas is really notorious for like not just having, I think it's called good faith or friendly or something, where you can just go practice in Texas. John Oliver did a whole thing on it. And I was sitting with my notepad horrified. I was like, oh my God, I'm never going to a hospital again anywhere. But there is that sense of like, people don't speak medical lingo, right? We don't know the jargon. Most of us don't know the legal jargon either. And then you put those together in these massive institutions that make a lot of money, and it costs us time and trauma and money to make these claims. That re-traumatizes people. Now, I talked to somebody who had a C-section she didn't want and ended up requiring an emergency hysterectomy and almost died. And she chose not to even complain because she's like, the process will be too much. And in some ways, that helped her because she felt control over it. But originally, in that first year afterwards, she was like, I really want to complain and I don't even know how. And it was just the overwhelming. So those kind of grievance processes, I think, are actually fundamental to building trust.
So I want to plug in this moment that Birth Monopoly has a whole resource on how to file a complaint. So I want to make sure people know about that. But I was wondering if the one woman you talked about who had the birth injury, did she consider suing? Had she expressed that to the hospital? Do you understand how that was all communicated?
She did not express it to the hospital. She expressed it to me when we talked about it. And I actually referred her to Birth Monopoly. I took one of Kristen's Know Your Rights in Childbirth class as a doula when I was doing my doula training. And I think it's a valuable legal resource for doulas, but for birth givers as well. I referred her there, and I think it was just so overwhelming. She really was just like, okay, I'm going to choose not to do this. But again, one of the reasons I do like that resource on Birth Monopoly is it gives people at least more of a choice of, am I going to choose to sue or not choose? Because even when you can control that one little thing, you're still taking back your own power, right? You're still taking back your own choice, which is very different than just being like, this happened to you, suck it out.
Yeah. I'm also curious to hear from the physician who gave birth, who described her experience as obstetric violence. What happened? Because not everyone listening may even know what obstetric violence is.
Right.
So can you tell us what that is, and then what happened to this doctor?
Well, I have been assured that it's not a thing, that obstetric violence isn't real and we're all just making it up. But assuming that people aren't completely lying, yes, obstetric violence is described in many different ways. The most common is as bullying or abuse or coercion during birth by professionals, whether that's a midwife, an OBGYN, a nurse. Somebody in the room does something outside of bounds, right? Either they can yell at you or insult you, or they can physically restrain you or force you to have interventions. That would be considered obstetric violence. And so for this person, had been giving birth, and the doctor was like holding her legs up, and she was like, I have to put my legs down because my hip hurts. And they wouldn't let her do that. The other doctor came in and they were actually physically holding her down, and she and her husband and her doula were begging that she was like, this is hurting my hip. I need to move. I need to roll over. And the doctor just said, no, no, you can't. And so she said, I just bear down and push the baby out because I knew this wouldn't stop until the baby was out. And so they were physically restraining her from moving, not even moving off of her back, which is how they were making her give birth, but just moving around in that area. She said her knee was like basically closer to her ear And
Ow.
as somebody with documented hip problems, this should have been a
Oh.
clear no. But yeah, so this was a huge part of her discussions. She said she and her husband had nightmares about it for months afterwards. So it was really, I was very surprised. Now, she had described a birth that to me sounded traumatic for her second birth. The physician gave her an episiotomy, which is an incision in the vaginal area, without asking her, and just yanked the baby out. And her response was, well, he was just old school. She was not at all traumatized by this. She had made a frame of reference in her mind. This is how that doctor behaves. And that's why I think talking about obstetric violence is so important, because it's probably under-recorded. People want to trust their doctors. They will put that trust into any kind of frame they can. This isn't somebody had a bad experience, they're overreacting. I heard a lot of bad experiences where people were like, but I know they did the best they could. And really giving people the benefit of the doubt. It had to be very egregious for people to talk about it as trauma. And out of 120, she was the only one who used the term obstetric violence, which is why I remembered it, because I was not expecting to hear that term at all.
And what do you think is behind, if you feel like you can comment, what do you think is behind this horrible thing happened to me, but why do you think people do that?
So two things. One, I think, is we do want to trust people. We want to, partly because we sometimes don't have a choice. There is that sense. And I think we all have an innate understanding that birth is never going to go as we have planned, and that things happen. And so there's a grace that I think we give other people. But for others, I think it's that they don't want to deal with the fact that they experience trauma. For some people, it is absolutely that sort of epistemic frame that they have of like, okay, I'm going to put this into the bucket of, I took the medicine I didn't want to take. And that's just how it has to happen. For other people, it is just really not being like able to deal with the fact that they experience trauma, that they experience something difficult.
Yeah. How has your research changed how you view the American healthcare system?
Oh, I don't know, because I was not particularly trustful of the healthcare system when I started. My first daughter was an attempted home birth, and I went to the hospital because my midwife said, you've been 7 centimeters dilated for 10 hours. We have to go. And I was so excited when I got there because they were great. But then the second that shift changed, that night team was awful. I was like, this is horrible. This confirms every one of my worst fears. And then my second was born at home because I was like, yeah, we're done here. And so I've always been a little bit mistrustful. I actually really like my doctor now. I love my pediatrician. Seeing how much bigger it is, seeing how many more people also have that mistrust was really eye-opening. I assumed, as a poor kid who grew up in the projects, who had the doctors who didn't want to see the welfare kids, who would look at my dirty shoes and just absolute disgust and shame me, thought that it was that poverty, it was that experience that had given me the mistrust. And then I'm talking to doctors and lawyers and people who graduated from Harvard. And, I'm like, oh, wow, this is bigger than I thought. And it spans race and class in ways that I had not imagined.
Yeah.
So we've got that all in common, which is nice. Let's build bridges.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I know for myself, one of the things that has really, I think mistrust is the right word, is seeing the variations in care. And seeing how many people receive care or are told things that are absolutely factually incorrect. For example, that no one attends VBAC. That VBAC, I mean, just like this, all of this work that I've done has really opened my eyes and given me a strong sense of distrust for the medical system and feeling like I need to be my advocate on every single topic.
And it's a burden.
I was just about to say,
it's a huge burden.
Weight. It's a huge weight to carry to try to become as well educated and as knowledgeable as I can on every single topic that I engage with the healthcare system. So that way I can feel like I can know what I'm talking about. And also I'll be able to identify misinformation and also know when to pick my battles. Yeah. It's a huge burden.
It is. And we're putting that burden where it doesn't belong. This is a system that is meant to help people. We are told it will help us. We pay them to help us. There needs
Yeah.
to be a part of the system that is set up to actually help more than just the physical body. And even then, we know, that it's not always helping the physical body. I went to your website because my second daughter was a VBAC. She was a vaginal birth after C-section at home.
Yeah.
And so, and it was like looking at all of the information, and I've sent that information to lots of people. I'm like, you need to go here, because there is, even in the best seat to give birth, right? There's still so much misinformation. 2 of the hospitals near us have, an 11% VBAC rate. Like, that's
Yeah.
unacceptable.
Yeah.
Like, that does not work. Like, compared to anywhere else in the world, this is not, consistent. And that's the thing about medical issues. While everybody's bodies may be different, while everybody's births may be different, those statistics are supposed to work out in the wash so that things are consistent across the board, and they are very not.
Exactly.
And that's where the
Exactly.
problem comes in.
And anytime we see disparities in, say, VBAC rates or outcomes or C-section rates, we have to question, why is that happening? And clearly, it's not because only 11% of people can have a VBAC. But unfortunately, if people don't have the facts, they really think, oh, well, only 11% of people had a VBAC at that hospital. Well, that must mean one of two things. VBAC must be really dangerous, like everyone says, and it must often result in a repeat cesarean, like many people say.
Right.
And I think that's why it's so important. I mean, of course, I'm going to advocate for people to have accurate information about VBAC,
Yes.
but I mean, it's across the board. And unfortunately, we have to be our own advocate, because there is no one else out there who's going to advocate for us the way we will.
Right. When I had 2 ultrasounds, each at 5 months with each of my children, just to make sure they were girls, because we only have girls in my family. I've got a lot of sisters, a lot of aunts, a lot of grandmothers. And I was at the ultrasound with my second, and this doctor, who was not my doctor, she's not somebody, I'd met her once with my other child 5 years prior, and then once now. And she was like, oh, which hospital? And I said, oh, I'm doing home birth, and I'm doing a VBAC at home. And she says, oh, well, you probably have like a 10% chance of that. I'm like, you've known me for 3.5 minutes. On what basis are you making this determination?
Yeah.
And it was really upsetting, like somebody who was younger or not as much of a stubborn person as I am, or didn't have that information, might have been really scared and thought, this is a person with a lab coat and a name tag and a machine that I don't understand. They must know. Like, no, she didn't know. Or she's like, oh, your baby might be too big. I had a 6-pound baby. She was politely sized, as my midwife said.
And I want to clarify, this was the like the person doing the scan, or was the person interpreting the scan?
She was both. She did the scan and interpreted it.
Okay, but it was a physician, not like not
right, not an OBGYN, and not even my physician, not my OB. Didn't know anything about my first birth, except that it was a C-section. That was all they knew. I was like, wow, okay.
Well, yeah, and so the power of misinformation, and also the power of misinformation from someone, like you said, in a lab coat with a name tag, working on a machine that you don't understand. I mean, immediately, so many people would think, well, you know more than I do. Maybe I am making a crazy decision.
Yeah, and it's so hard because there is so much politicization of public health right now, so much misinformation and mistrust in areas I don't want there to be mistrust.
Yeah.
And so I don't come in here just to throw grenades at the system and be like, let's not trust anybody. There is expertise. It does exist. We should trust it. And one of my biggest angers is I'm supposed to be able to trust my doctor with this information. And when I can't, all that does is make me susceptible to any other rabbit hole I'm going to run down in any other form of public health misinformation, which is really dangerous and really problematic.
Yes. So what are your biggest pieces of advice for women and birthing people?
So first and foremost, hire a doula. If you don't want to have a doula, get somebody that you trust who's not your support person. Yes, your support person, your husband, your partner, your whatever, sure. But get somebody else too who can kind of help you, take care. But also really think to yourself, like, what is my ideal scenario? How do I get from my ideal to less? How do I get from less ideal to, oh no, it's an emergency C-section? What information am I going to need to do that? And honestly, try not to be afraid. I know I'm saying all this stuff and it sounds scary, but the more fear you go in with, that's the energy you're going to meet, and it's going to be hard.
Yeah.
Go in with cautious skepticism. Uh, as I like to say, be a little bit skeptical, but certainly cautious. If you can go to a place with midwives, I highly recommend midwives, doulas, any of that care that's going to be more one-on-one. Now, I know all of this costs a lot of money. So for people who don't have a choice, you have one hospital and it's 100 miles away, focus on what you can control. And that is trying to get the information that you're going to need to feel better about your choices. And ultimately, whether it's a great experience or a bad experience, share it. Tell people
Yeah.
about it. Find a community to talk about it, because great experience or not, birth is hard. It's a lot. It's a lot physically. It's a lot emotionally. And sometimes you need to unload it on somebody who can be a nice neutral party and listen to you, and have good friends. Don't tell bad friends who are just going to say weird things. Have supportive friends, the pump you up kind of friends. That'll help.
Yeah. So how about for clinicians? What are your biggest pieces of advice for clinicians regarding medical mistrust?
Understand, genuinely, some people come in mistrustful. It's not about you. I know as a teacher, I know how annoying it is for students to come in and think I'm trying to indoctrinate them because a teacher did, or somebody on the news told them I would. Try not to take that mistrust personally. Do what you can do, meet people where they are and say, like, okay, I understand. You've had a difficult experience. Here's what I'm going to do. And really try to keep the lines of communication open. Understand that what you are doing to someone's body. And you need to see them as more than just a body. Because otherwise, they're going to continue that mistrust.
Yeah. What do you wish all women and birthing people knew?
Oh, gosh. I wish that they all knew that there are people who are going to support you in this, that there are so many people who are rooting for you, whether you know them or not. I am rooting for you. I don't care when or how or where you're giving birth, whatever. Just assume I am rooting for you to be okay. And that, it's okay to have a good experience. It's okay to walk out and be like, yeah, this is awesome. I don't know why you guys are trying to scare me. Don't feel ashamed about that. But it's also okay to have a bad experience. I wish you wouldn't, but it's okay to say that you did and to feel whatever you're feeling. It's okay to have a C-section. It's okay to request a C-section. It's okay to not want that, right? It's okay to breastfeed.
Yeah.
It's okay to bottle feed. It's okay. You should be able to do whatever you need to do to feel good, as long as it's not actually hurting somebody else. And, depending on who it's hurting, we'll talk. But in general, try to not compare your experience to other people, and don't let other people do that for you. Try not to let other people kind of drag you into the judgment zone, because that gets overwhelming as a new parent and as a birthing person. And don't try to have an empowering birth, right? You're busy. You don't need to have an epiphany. It's okay. It's cool if you do, like, let us know. But you don't need to do that either, right? Sometimes empowering birth just means you got through it. And that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you wish all clinicians knew about medical mistrust?
You need to address it, particularly when it's people who are non-gender conforming, people who are coming from a different social class, certainly racism. I mean, we have to admit that medical racism is real. Maybe you personally are not a racist, and that's great, but that doesn't mean that your patient hasn't experienced racism. That doesn't mean that the institution you're working in is set up to actually be inclusive. And you need to acknowledge the fact that you are working in an institution that has been problematic to some people, and do what you can do. Try not to take that personally unless you're actually being horrible, and then you should take it personally. But try to work with your patients, try to explain to them what's going on, and try to understand that sometimes they're not going to like you. That just happens.
What's the most important thing that you want people to take away from your research on medical mistrust?
That you should listen to people's birth stories. You should not just kind of disregard women as being hysterical or not knowing. So many people, why do you want to talk to moms? Or, well, are you sure that's really what happened? Or is that just what they think happened? But half of my dissertation is written in language that is really passes the buck in a way that infuriates me. But I wanted to be done with it, so I did it. to say, well, this is how so-and-so experienced this event. Because even, well-meaning, supposedly liberal people are like, well, how do we know we can trust women's stories? They won't tell us we're lying, but they mean it, right? They mean that we're not quite there with the truth. And so I think even for women, the idea that we just really mistrust women's experiences, especially when they complain, is problematic. Stop doing it. Like, if I could take one thing away from my research, tell people to stop doing that. Trust women, believe their stories. If you have a reason not to, okay. But don't just go in and think, oh, she just likes to complain, or, oh, they just like to complain about childbirth. Well, sure, because it's hard and it's gross, frankly. All the bodily fluids. No, thank you. But it also can be that somebody's had a really horrible experience, and they should be able to discuss that.
So I know you have a book coming out soon. Can you tell us more about it?
So I just signed the contract yesterday. I'm super excited. I had been pitching this book and everybody told me, no, you need to wait until you have a few more articles. So I sent the book proposal to a guy at Harvard who was like, we don't do this. And he was really cool, though, because he said, here's a guy I think at the University of Kansas who you might like. So I sent it to David at the University of Kansas, who's like, I need you on a Zoom call. And David worked overtime to sell this pitch to the University of Kansas Press. He starts talking to me, of course, about his wife's birth story, right? That's what happens.
Yeah.
And so it's called Birthzillas and Madwives, The Politics of Childbirth. And it centers birth stories. And we talk about, it's public facing because I want people to go to Barnes & Noble and see it and pick it up, right? I don't want this to be written for 13 academics who love the fancy language. But it does talk about things like VBACs. It talks about consent, bodily autonomy. It talks about midwives versus medical model of care. It talks about comparative use of technology in the U.S. versus other industrialized nations. And it talks about something called epistemic justice, which is a justice based on, listening to people's stories, right? Understanding epistemology is the study of how we know. And the idea that we know different things because we have different experiences. And women experience what's called testimonial injustice. You hear their story, their testimony, and without any evidence or any care, you dismiss it because they're just women. And so that's really what my book centers, is this, we can understand all of this through these experiences, and then really coming back to saying, why aren't we? If we want better policy, we need to see how it's being experienced by the people on the ground. And that's what's going to be useful. So I'm super excited about it.
So awesome. Is there anything else you'd like to share about your work?
I've got a podcast. You can also come listen. It's called Birthzilla's, the podcast. And I, go over a lot of basically what's in the book and talk about consent. We're on episode 4 or 5, talking about medical model of care versus midwife model of care, and really sharing all of the stories that aren't going to make it into the book because I had 120 of them. That's a lot of stories. So it's really cool to be able to talk to people about birth, and not something I ever thought I'd be doing, but here we are.
Tell me more about the word Birthzilla and how you decided to incorporate that into your podcast and book.
So I was reading Millie Hill's Give Birth Like a Feminist. And in it, she talks about this Irish OBGYN who was just going around the hospital complaining about all these middle-class birthzillas who think they're the only person who ever gave birth. And I was like, there's another B word that feminists work really hard to reclaim. But in a lot of ways, birth has been left out of the feminist movement. So I'm like, well, we're going to bring birth back to the feminist movement, and we're going to reclaim Birthzilla too. And we're going to take that as ours. And I've decided we're using it. And so, it became this sense of unapologetically care about your birth story, care about your birth experience, and don't apologize to anybody for that. You don't need to be a jerk. You don't need to run around and be mean, but just, sometimes you got to activate Birthzilla mode. And that's okay.
Well, and I also want to circle back to that idea that you shared about not being defensive about your birth. I think so much of that comes from this feeling that everyone is judging you. But I think I know it's hard, but who cares what rando people on the internet think about your birth?
And I'm 40 now, and let me tell you, the older I get, the more who cares I get, and it's glorious.
Yes, exactly. Great. So the idea of defending yourself, or I had to have a C-section because, share your story, but come from a place of like, these are the choices I made. This is the birth that I had. And leave the defensiveness behind because you don't need to carry that weight. You can let it go. And
Well, and
let it
remember,
go.
a lot of people on the internet aren't people, they're bots. And a lot of
Yes.
those bots infiltrate all sorts of communities. There are a bunch of teenagers in Macedonia who make a lot of money infiltrating different communities online and just sowing discord wherever they are.
Yes.
And so, if somebody's really giving you a hard time, assume they're a bot and move on. And if they're not,
Yeah.
well, then they shouldn't have acted like it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Thank you so much for being with us today, Amber. I appreciate your research, your work, you coming and sharing your story with us. And in doing so, sharing the story of so many other people.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Happy to, share all the stories.
Absolutely. And until next time, I'm Jen Campbell with VBAC Facts. And do not forget what we're about. Since 2007, our mission has been to provide accurate information on vaginal birth after cesarean and repeat cesarean to parents, professionals, policymakers, and the court, so all decisions can be informed, ethical, and just. I'll see you again in 2 weeks. Take care.